All right, so we'll continue moving on with our design. To me, it feels natural to keep going with another set of limbs, maybe the arms. And naturally, in at least in my case, the arms will be symmetrical. So I'll be using myself of our dear old friend, the symmetry object that we've grown very fond of during the past few lessons, I hope. So yeah, we'll hop into Cinema and get going with that straight away. Okay, so like before, we can actually start with creating our symmetry object. So I'll just go ahead and fold these in just so we have a clear object panel to work with. And I'll come down here again, press and hold, and release on our symmetry. We will call this our arms symmetry. Nice. And after that, we can come over again to our primitives panel, and I'll create a cylinder. And I'll just go ahead and rotate that immediately 90 degrees like this. And if you're having a hard time snapping the degrees here, if you hold shift before you start to rotate, it doesn't work for some reason. But if you press shift after you've started to rotate, so if I start rotating and then hold shift, that's when it actually starts snapping. I know that some people have a hard time with that when I usually do lectures. But we'll go ahead and roughly place this where we want it. I'll go ahead and drag it. Oops. I'll make sure that I just drag it in the x-axis in this case. Somewhere around here. I'll go ahead and scale this down a lot. Maybe somewhere around here. Set the radius to something like this. Yeah, something around 8 centimeters. I think works for us. And we can go ahead and drag it and drop it into our arm symmetry. So we have it being affected by the symmetry object, and I'll pull this up so we have the arms kind of starting somewhere around where the collar will end. So I guess somewhere around here will work for us. And I do want some roundings on each side here. So if I just go ahead and come into our cylinder caps here, I can just go ahead and activate the fillet, and I'll increase the radius of this and also increase the segments somewhere around, 10. 10 will work. And I'll actually move, I'm starting to see the cap coming out here, so I'll move this in just so we're not having that piece of the arm visible. Something like that. And with our first piece of geometry for our arms, we can actually go ahead and group this so we can add all of our arm elements into this null. So I'll go ahead and have our cylinder selected, press Alt-G, which will create a null, and we'll call this arm null. And we'll actually do something right now that we haven't done yet. So I want our axis point. I'll come over here to our front view just so we can view this from a better angle. I want our arm null axis to be at the point where basically the shoulder will be rotating from. Since we are going to animate this, we need to think about this kind of stuff. And if I do want to move our null while we have the cylinder as a child of it, you'll see that we're going to move the entire group basically. And if I just want to change the axis point and not the actual position of our entire null, there's a really handy way of activating the enable axis modification mode here. So if I select this or press L, the handle kind of changes just a bit, like it adds a bit of a square in the center of it. And now we can actually move this without moving the actual null's position. And I want this to snap to this line because this is basically the perfect rotation point of the end of this cylinder. And if I want to snap it at the mathematically correct position, I need to enable what's called the snapping mode, which you can do here. So if I press here and enable snap or hit Shift S, this will start to snap to different features of the cylinder. And if it doesn't snap to the edges, you can just press here at the snap settings and just make sure that it snaps at either points or edges. So in this case, points is enough actually. So we'll snap it here to this point. And if I go ahead and deactivate the enable axis here, we can see now if we hop out into our perspective view here that if we start to rotate this, it will rotate along the shoulder of our character rather than the middle of the group that we previously created. And what we can do next is add some kind of sleeve that comes out of our poncho here. So I'm kind of seeing that the cylinder that we just created is basically like the skin of our arms, basically. So we want to add some clothing that then kind of comes out of our poncho here. So to do that, we'll keep working within our arms symmetry. And I'll actually go ahead and duplicate this cylinder that we created for our arm. So I'll just control, drag and drop above here. And I'll go ahead and actually deactivate both fillet and caps here. So now we actually have a hollow cylinder that we're working with. And like always, you can see now that we have very few segments to work with. So if I just hold and select both of these cylinders, we can just edit the segments here both at the same time. So I'll just set this to 32 rotation segments, something like that. And we want our, or at least in my case, I want the sleeve to be kind of like at an elbow's length. So I'll just start shortening the sleeve here. And as you can tell, we still have our snap enabled. So I'll just make sure that I have that turned off. I'll shorten that. I'll widen the thickness of it just a bit. And I'll just go ahead and drag it in, something like this. And I kind of want the sleeve to be hanging off the top of the arm here. So I don't want it to be like uniformly bigger than the arm. I want the bottom of the sleeve to be like hanging away from the arm a bit. And we can actually do this with a taper, but using it in a slightly different way than we did before. So if I, like before, come into the deformers panel here, create a taper, we'll drag that so it's a child of our sleeve cylinder here. I'll set this to fit to parent, and it's actually at the correct axis right now, so I'm happy with that. And I'll actually set this taper to -25. And I don't want a curvature on this kind of taper either, so I'll just decrease this to maybe around 20, something like that. But as you can tell, we're still tapering this away from the arm. But if we just take the taper and drag it up a bit, so it kind of aligns with the top of our sleeve here, you can tell that it only tapers from the center of our taper object. And since we have moved the center of our taper object, it just tapers downwards basically. So if I just keep doing this, it will grow even bigger at the bottom. Now, this will also happen along the sides, not just the bottom, which means that I don't want to go overboard with this taper. I kind of want to leave it at around -25 degrees. So something like that I think will work. And I think we can move on from the sleeve with that done. So what we want to do next are the hands actually. And before we even create any geometry, we can go ahead and create a null where we will be dropping all of our fingers and stuff into. So I'll just go ahead and create a null. I'll drag this into our arm null, and we'll go over to our coordinates of this new null, and we'll zero out all of the axis here just so we have it at the 0 position of our arm nulls, just so we have a clean slate while we're working. And I'll go ahead and name this hand, just so we are nice and organized while we're working. And like we did with our arm null here, when I snapped it along the edge of our arm cylinder, I'll want to do this, but on the other end. So I'll go ahead and enable snap. I'll drag this all the way out so it snaps to right at the point where the cap starts to round off here. And as we're done with that, I'll just deactivate snap by hitting Shift S. And I'll come out of our front view here, back to our perspective view, and we'll start to create our finger geometry actually. And I want these like round and nice sausage fingers to kind of go along with our chunky shape language that we've started to create. So, and to do that, we can use ourselves of a capsule. You might be wondering why we even used a cylinder here and not just a capsule for our arm. And that was just because we wanted to duplicate this cylinder to work as a sleeve as well, so we could take off the caps. And you can use a cylinder and just round it off with a fillet or a capsule. They have the same kind of properties, so it doesn't really matter. But in this case, I will be using a capsule for the fingers. So I'll just create a capsule from our primitives panel. I'll go ahead and scale it down using our scale tool. And I'll just go ahead and I'll actually place it within our hand null that we just created. Zero out all of the coordinates, hit enter, and we can go ahead and start placing this. So I'm going to place this as if this was my middle finger, or I'm kind of seeing the character just having 4 fingers, so three like fingers and a thumb basically. So we don't have too much detail. I kind of like the look of just having this cartoonish kind of hand. So I'm kind of seeing that I'm creating this middle finger at first, and then I'm going to use the middle finger to create the pointy and the pinky finger and the thumb. So I'll just set that in place before I move on with the other fingers. So I'll just reduce the thickness to around 3.5 centimeters. I think will work. Move it out just a bit. And I think the length of this actually works pretty well. So something like this. And I'll come over to the coordinates and just see where we place it in the x-axis here. So something maybe like this. So we don't want the finger to be like sticking out of our arm like this. We kind of want it to be flushed against the top of our kind of hand shape. So maybe I think this could be a good placement of this. And with that, I'll actually go ahead and group this. So I'll hit Alt-G, and we can call this our, let's call it middle finger. Oops, not all caps, middle finger, like that. And I'll do the exact same thing as I did with the hand and the shoulder. I'll snap the axis to the beginning part of this, this rounding here. So I'll press L, which activates this axis mode here. I'll activate snap, and we'll snap it to this edge right here. Great. And I'll deactivate snap, deactivate axis mode, hop out here. And now you can tell that we can actually rotate our finger from an axis that makes sense. So that works for us. So with this in place, we can actually go ahead and create the other fingers, and you could use a cloner for this, but I will want to be a bit more precise with my placings, and like placing things within a cloner might be a bit more restrictive in terms of like if you want to individually rotate things and stuff. So there is a way to create a copy of an object while you still have the other object linked to the original one. And I'll kind of show you what that means, but it's called creating an instance. So if I just come over here to our panel and I have this instant object thingy here. So if I just release on this, you don't have to hit Alt for this. If I just have the object that I want to basically duplicate and release on the instance icon here, that will create an instance at the exact same position as my original one. But I want to drag this into our handle here, and I'll just kind of show you what this does. So I'll move this out just a bit, and I'll maybe also want to rotate this one out because it feels a bit too close to our middle finger. And I'll kind of just move this in 1 centimeter or so, something like that. Now, if I wanted to, for example, make this much longer or something, which I might want to do later on, I don't have to do that for every single finger because these instances that I've been creating will be directly linked to my middle finger here, which is great now when we're modeling. And like you see, we don't have a lot of details to work with here, so I'll just go ahead and increase our segments. And since I have them linked by an instance, this will be, all of these changes will be applicable on our instances. So that's exactly what I wanted to do. And I'll just go ahead and name this our pinky, and I can duplicate this instance actually, and I'll set this at the other side of our hand. So that would be the X or the Z position that I'll change. So I'll just set this to -4 instead of +4, and I'll set this to +10 degrees instead of -10 degrees. So that will put it at the exact same spot, but on the other side of the hand, something like that. And even though these fingers might be intersecting with one another, it doesn't really matter. That kind of goes with our look, I think. And I just extended the distance here between these fingers just a bit. So I'll set them to 4.5 on both sides, just so we have that like that. Perfect. And I might even go ahead and just move both of these in just a bit. Might even drag them down. Yeah, like that. Nice. And let's also make sure that we name this our pointy. And I'll eventually want to animate these fingers bending. And instead of like rigging these and skinning them and stuff, since it's such a like basic motion, like bending this finger, we can actually use a deformer for that. So I'll just go ahead and come over here to the bend icon here. And since this is like the poster boy of all deformers, it's available by just clicking on the deformers panel here. So I'll just click that and I'll drag this and put it as a child for our capsule. I will head into object here and set this to fit to parent. And then we can start to see what this is doing. Now with the bend deformer, the original setting is not like how a bending object actually would work, because this is actually extending the length of our object, and we don't want that. So if we set this to keep length, it will just basically keep the object at the same length as it is originally. And you can tell that as we are bending these, we are seeing our segments here. So we'll need to increase our height segments just a bit. So let's just set that to 12. And if I were to, for example, like make a fist with this hand, I will probably want to bend this pretty far. And since our bend object is sized at like even the outer edges of our caps, it's kind of bending the shape for some reason, which I don't really like. I want the roundings of our capsule to be perfectly round. And to avoid like having this to happen, I can actually decrease the size of our bend deformer. So I'll just decrease it to somewhere around, in my case, 11 degrees. So now the bend deformer is actually ending right where our caps start. So we're not really deforming the round shape at the end. So we're just basically bending the straight parts of our capsule. And I think we can just set this to just have these bent just slightly as just a nice pose as we're working through this. And even though we have deformers unfiltered here, like we did before, when you are working with instances for some reason, these will be displaying deformers. So if we want to hide this, I don't think I've shown you this yet, but these little dots here, if we click them, you can hide objects. So green means that something is visible, red means that it's invisible, and if it's grayed, it's basically defaulted, which means that it's visible. But for example, if I were to hide our arm symmetry but want our middle finger or let's say our sleeve being visible, if I set this to green, it will override the invisibility status here. And the reason why there are two dots is because this means the editor, which is where we are working, and this means the renderer. So if I, for example, wanted to hide something while rendering but edit it while working in the viewfinder, this is how you would turn that on and off. And if we hold Alt and click both of them, or one of them, they will both change color. So yeah, just kind of showing you how that works. So with that, we can actually just go ahead and make our bend invisible, just so we don't see the deformer as we're working. Now, we also want her to have a thumb, and since the thumb is a bit different of a shape than the fingers would be, it will be a bit shorter, for example. We're not going to use an instance to do that, so we'll just go ahead and duplicate our original middle finger and null. So I'll just control and drag and drop this, and I'll just call this the thumb, and I can just go ahead and set this to the 0 position of our hand. And I'll go ahead and move this out in the Z. And naturally, I want to rotate the thumb out a bit. So I'll just rotate it up to 90 degrees, something like that. And I kind of want the thumb to be placed maybe somewhere around here. I'll go ahead and shorten it just a bit at first. So maybe like 14 degrees. I'll also scale down the bend a bit while I do that. So we can actually just go ahead and try and bend the thumb, see how that feels. So I think this length might be pretty good, actually. What if I rotate this up? Yeah, I think that feels natural and good. Maybe I want to scale down the bend even more. Yeah, that's nice, actually. So I'll just go ahead and reset the bend here, something like that. It's something that looks nice while we're working. Feels a bit too long, right? I'll move it in just a tiny bit, something like that. So the reason why I wanted to put our hand null at the center of the cap rounding here is so when we rotate, we're basically rotating it around this. So there's like kind of a circle that's forming. I'm just going to show you with the doodle paint here. So there's kind of a circle that's forming at the end of this cap. It's almost as if it's like this sphere placed at the end of our cylinder. So I'm kind of imagining that this is the like palm of our hand. So that's where we want to have our hand rotating from, because then even like regardless of how we rotate the hand later on, it won't be moving out of our arm shape. It will still be like attached to our arm cylinder. Okay, I think this is starting to look pretty good. Let's actually try and rotate our arm null here, because we will be animating this, so it's good to kind of stress test things as we are designing. And as you can tell, the rotation from the shoulders are looking really good, but we do see how our sleeve is getting detached from our poncho, which we don't want. So we obviously want the same kind of rounding that we have on our arms here. But we want a hollow sleeve that ends right at the elbow mark here. So we'll need to make this sleeve cylinder editable. And what this means is basically we'll be allowed to manipulate the vertices and faces individually, but that will also mean that all of our object parameters here, like the radius, height, and the segments and stuff, will be removed. So we won't be able to actually edit the segments and the radius with numbers any longer. So we'll basically just be in control of the vertices. I do try and avoid making things editable when I'm working, because that means that you usually can't edit these kind of values once you've gone editable. However, for us, this is a bit of a crucial solution. So we do need to make this cylinder editable and add basically the caps back in at the end of our sleeve here. So I'll actually just go ahead and make our poncho invisible just so we see what we're doing here. And we'll expand our arm symmetry here. We'll call this sleeve just so we're aware of where it is. And to make things editable, you either hit C or you control click and click this button here, make editable. And as you can tell, like this little pen stands for actually being able to customize these objects beyond the attributes that a cylinder might have. But before we do that, we actually want to turn on our caps again. So I'll just come over here to our cylinder and turn on the caps and the fillet. And that will kind of result in our cylinder getting a bit shorter. So we will need to extend the length of this just a bit so it at least covers the arm cylinder. So I'll also make sure that our rounding is as rounded as we can have it, something like that. Great. And with that in place, now we can actually make it editable. So I'll just hit C, and you'll see how our cylinder icon turns into a polygon icon. And that means that we can actually go in and start to select these faces here. And while I'm working with this, I want to turn off our taper because we're not seeing the actual shape that we're working with. So I'll just turn off the taper here, and now we can actually start to delete some faces here. So to do this in a very precise way, so we're making sure that we're not deleting any unwanted faces, I'll come over here to our front view. I will select our live selection tool, which is basically just a way to draw a selection. And I will make sure that the visible only check mark here is turned off, because we want to select everything that's also behind the view that we're viewing right now. So I'll just hold Control and scroll drag to increase the size of this. And I'll just kind of paint pretty carefully where I want to delete these faces. So I don't want to delete any faces where the straight part of the shape begins. So once I have these selected, I'll just hit delete or backspace, which will delete them. And we can hop back into our perspective view to see what we've done. Now we can actually go ahead and reactivate our taper like that. Great. And let's turn on the poncho null again, just so we can see how this is looking now when we are rotating the arms. So I'll turn that on. And now if we rotate our arm, you can kind of see that we still have our shoulder visible, but we're not seeing the ends of the sleeve. So we're kind of having this like very cool and graphical shape of our shoulder here being this perfectly rounded shape. So I think I can actually move this in just a bit more, something like that. And yeah, I think this is good for now. We can come back and edit this if we see that the rig demands some form of more extreme rotation, but I think this will be fine for us. Perfect. We can go ahead and turn back our garage shading without the lines, so we can view our character in its more beautiful form. And looking at this, I think we can actually increase the size of our sleeves. They are Yeah, I think they can be a bit bigger. And now since we have our sleeve edited, this is a bit easier to do when you can actually edit the vertices and the edges and stuff instead of working through the attributes of our cylinder. So if we just come over to our sleeve, select that, and go into the vertice or the points mode. So this is just different ways of editing the parts of our geometry. So if I just go ahead and hit Control A, which will select all of these, and I want to scale this just in the Z axis, we can do that to our points instead of the coordinates of our object. And you can tell if I scale this in the X axis like this, it will scale it from the center. But if I want to scale this from the top, so I'm basically just scaling it downwards, we can come over here. If you have the scale tool activated, you come over here to axis, and you can just slide this modeling axis up and down here. So if I set the x-axis in my case to 100% and start scaling this, I will basically just scale it downwards, which is exactly what I want to do. So I'll just do it at, so we snap it, I'll hold shift and snap it at around 110%. Yeah, I think that's a good shape. I like that. So now if we deactivate our taper, you can see that we have scaled it a bit further down, but I think that's okay. We're kind of happy with this sort of shape, so it's fine that we're making some irreversible decisions for our design. But yeah, with that in place, I think we can move on. And as mentioned previously, if we're unhappy with something down the line, we can just come back and edit it. But for now, I think we're happy with where we're at, and we'll just keep going in the next lesson.